as well as CEUs available to folks who are joining the meeting. In order to access that continuing education documentation, you'll need to complete the evaluation that will be emailed to you at the end of the day today or possibly first thing tomorrow. At the end of that evaluation, there'll be a link to a CEU certificate. If you want a CME, there will be a place to indicate that, and the CMEs will be emailed to you a few weeks after today. We have no financial conflict of interest to announce. And now I would like to introduce our moderator today. Today, our moderator is Dr. Patty Shannon. She is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities of Social Work. She is also a licensed psychologist with a vast array of experiences and currently is the behavioral health team lead here in Minnesota on the state response initiative for the Afghan resettlement program, which is happening at great pace here and throughout the country. Dr. Shannon, I'll pass it to you to talk about today's learning objectives.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited about this webinar for obvious reasons, and I just review here with you the learning objectives, which are to describe examples of the resettlement stressors and potential impact on the mental health of Afghan arrivals. The webinar will provide examples of how Afghans may speak about and understand distress, including providing examples of Afghan idioms of distress. You will understand some ways in which Afghans may seek help and understand the purpose and use of the empirically derived Afghan symptom checklist. I'm very pleased to introduce the expert speakers for today. First, Dr. Alemi is a global health researcher with a focus on understanding the social and psychological challenges endured by populations affected by political violence. His research includes studies of refugees and asylum seekers, which have contributed to expanding basic knowledge about the unmet socioeconomic needs of refugee communities here in the U.S. and abroad, and how various social factors, including discrimination, add to the burden of their adjustment challenges. A notable result of his research entails the development of an explanatory cultural model of distress and depression for Afghan refugees, which has informed clinicians and therapists alike in their direct practice with this group. Dr. Alemi's most recent studies include surveys of young people in post-war Afghanistan that examine stress, daily hassles, and resiliency, suicidality in Pakistan, Muslim American minorities, civic engagement, identity, and religious stigma. I'm also pleased to introduce Dr. Ken Miller, who is a senior researcher at War Child Holland in Amsterdam, where he develops and evaluates mental health interventions for refugees. He is the author of War Torn: Stories of Courage, Love, and Resilience, as well as the editor of The Mental Health of Refugees. For more than 25 years, he has studied the impact of war and displacement on civilians. In addition to his research, he writes a popular blog on Psychology Today called The Refugee Experience. As Ellen mentioned, we will be taking your questions in chat and I believe holding them until the end of the formal presentation. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Ellen and Dr. Shannon, for the warm. I'm an associate professor of research methods at Loma Linda University, a small health sciences institute in Southern California, about Afghanistan for my students. And, they've come to understand Afghanistan, the Afghan people, as a pretty volatile place, which probably isn't far from the truth. But, to some extent, maybe even the Afghans as a dangerous people. And, I try to tell them that, that there's more to Afghanistan than just this label of the graveyard of empire, the label thrown about Afghanistan, that refer to, the Afghan wars as the forever wars,
Doctor, let
picked
me,
as
if I
essential
may
Afghan people.
interject, I'm so sorry, but I think there are some bandwidth issues. Would you be able to turn off your video so that we can more clearly hear your voice? So sorry to
Yes, I'll go ahead and
interrupt,
do
but
that.
I don't want to miss a word. Yes, that's definitely more clear. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Okay, very good, very good. Okay, so I just like to emphasize a few of Afghan cultural values that really essentially serve as sources of strength and resilience for this group. I also like to talk about adversities and help seeking. And help seeking, all I can glimpse of help seeking. That's because, help seeking you'll find is a very understudied topic in the Afghan diaspora. So about societal norms, right, which have real meaning when it comes to help seeking, because again, societal norms and values dictate help seeking. So we can't talk about without touching on norms and values. So we'll talk about the assaults on the culture and the Afghan diaspora and also their mental health problems, which you'll see essentially align with a lot of studies of refugees that have been conducted, and that rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD are moderate to high among this population, and that there's a number of factors that contribute to these negative mental health outcomes. And then I'll also talk about help seeking formal or biomedical and informal systems, and then circle back to sources of strength and resilience, and maybe conclude with some of the takeaways from my talk. So the Afghan people, societal norms and values. So in Afghanistan, family is the single most important institution in Afghan society. So individual honor actually comes from the fulfillment of family obligations and following rules of etiquette that dictate behavior around women and women's behavior around men, and also respect for elderly and loyalty to friends and colleagues and being forthright. Bravery and hospitality are very important tenets of Afghan culture, and women are essentially central to these values, right? So the protecting women is a way by which Afghan men specifically uphold honor. And so women play a very important role in society, right? Not to say that women, don't have agency or any sort of independence. I think, to a point, they played a vital role in the country's economy before all these wars and conflicts erupted. So they play a very important role, even though they are very much protected by their male counterparts. So again, the society places much emphasis on etiquette, and this etiquette is seen or viewed as being profoundly aligned with Islamic beliefs. Okay, so it was assaults on cultural values or encroachments um, on families and the role of women in society that led to the first war in Afghanistan against the Soviets. So essentially, elements within the government, along with their Soviet counterparts, wanted to Sovietize the society by, dictating or essentially diminishing these rules of etiquette that people lived by, for centuries. And it didn't sit well for, people in villages and rural areas who took up arms to, essentially rebel against the government, which led to the Soviet-Afghan War. And this war resulted in the exodus of about 6 million Afghans, most of whom who resettled in Pakistan and Iran. About 500,000 resettled in Western Europe and the United States. And following the Soviet-Afghan War, which ended in 1989, we had civil wars, factional fighting between various warlords, which resulted in another wave of migrants that left the country, as you can see here. And then we also had Taliban rule during that third wave of migration. The third wave of migration was the result of Taliban rule, where people essentially sought refuge in Iran and Pakistan mainly. And then this fourth wave, the US NATO intervention and the fall of the Taliban, most people were displaced internally, but thousands of Afghans were resettled in the United States under the SIV scheme, or the Special Immigrant Visa Scheme. And what's different about those resettled in the SIV scheme versus this current evacuee situation that's taking place right now is that, you have many of these SIVs are individuals who, of course, helped, the U.S. Army in Afghanistan, but and it's really them and their young families that have been resettling, over the years since about 2005 or so. But with this evacuee crisis, we're seeing that it's not just them, it's not just these individuals who have helped the Americans or NATO forces in Afghanistan, but it's them and their extended families. So you can expect, a lot of elderly women and men and many children and just, you know, different demographics than what we've seen under the SIV scheme, essentially. So this number of about 65,000 people, if I have my figures right, that have been recently resettled across military bases in the United States adds to the current population of Afghans, which is around 135,000, most of whom reside in California. And Northern California, the San Francisco Bay Area was where at one point they were mainly concentrated, but a lot of Afghans have moved to the Central Valley in California, especially after the 2008 recession because of, housing prices and, better job opportunities in the Sacramento area. So we see a movement of population here. So you can, it's safe to say that there are close to about 200,000 Afghans that reside in the United States today. So what does the research say on Afghan refugees, the mental health related research? So I conducted a systematic review of pretty much anything and everything that has been published on Afghan refugees in Western nations. That includes, Western Europe, of course, Australia, New Zealand, and United States. And I essentially find, my findings essentially mirrored findings from other refugee groups, and that, Afghans report moderate to high levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms, and that, there's a dose-response relationship between traumas encountered and PTSD symptoms, no surprise there, and that, older age, female gender, and acculturative stress, contribute to their distress levels, right, or their mental health outcomes. Okay. So not included in this systematic review was this study that was recently conducted by a colleague and I that looked at a different type of stressor. I guess you can call it a new type of stressors that Afghans are experiencing, and that's perceived ethnic discrimination. We found that, assaults on their self-concept, assaults on their ethnicity or religious identity actually was associated with higher levels of distress among the first generation group of Afghans residing in Northern California. And we found that pre-resettlement traumas actually moderated this relationship in the sense that individuals reporting higher levels of pre-resettlement trauma were affected by discriminatory stress more so than individuals who reported lower levels of pre-resettlement trauma. So I think this is a salient thing to consider in thinking about these new evacuees that are resettling here, and speaking with leaders in the community about discrimination and Afghans not really being equipped to handle the stresses of discrimination on top of pre-migration and post-resettlement economic stressors, is that we have to remind Afghans that America is really for everyone. And I think this is really important for women who wear hijab, who at one point wore burqas in Afghanistan, and here are questioning, perhaps their identity and whatnot. So we have to be very cognizant of this type of stressor, especially for women who are, visibly Muslim and potentially targets of discrimination. So what do the qualitative studies say in my systematic review? I'll just look at that last bullet, because post-resettlement stressors are things that Dr. Miller is going to cover in his talk. But what about help seeking? What did the studies say about help seeking? There's essentially 3 studies that talk about help seeking. It's very limited and they're qualitative in design. And, they emphasize that family and informal networks play an integral role to coping with adversities, right? And family actually plays a role in filling the void in the provision of incongruent health services. Now, this is not to say that all Afghans think this way. This is just based on a sample of about three different studies, a couple of them conducted in Australia and one of them here in the US, that essentially show that, the perception of, professional help is that it's incongruent, is that, it's not, the providers are not culturally competent essentially to handle their challenges, right? So the way they cope with their stress is through, religious activities and seeking support from family members and maintaining hope and keeping oneself busy or preoccupied, right? And some of the barriers are listed there, such as lack of language appropriate mental health services, distrust and poor knowledge of mental health services, and stigma associated with help seeking as well. So this is just based on three studies of Afghan refugees, and their help seeking is very limited, but I hope this provides some insight. And probably not surprising, because a lot of the ways in which Afghans seek help aligns very much with the way other refugees seek help. So, but there's one quantitative study that I found that actually looks at patterns of help seeking in a sample of about 150 people out in Australia. 44% of whom met criteria for clinically significant PTSD and 15% for clinically significant depression. The most common source of help for mental health problems for this group of individuals was, seeing their GPs. And a lot of that was predicted by functional impairment scores. So it seems like they had, physical symptoms that really prompted their, help seeking from GPs. But then surprisingly, I see that, over a third, sought help from a psychologist, and about a third sought help from a psychiatrist, and only 9% sought help from family members. So the self-recognition of PTSD and depression, those individuals who were able to self-recognize PTSD and depression were 5 times more likely to seek help. So in another study that these authors did is they, examined their views of PTSD and depression and what they thought it was, if they were able to, who these individuals are who are not self-recognizing depression and PTSD. A lot of, these individuals defined their depression as, just sadness, and other studies will show you that, sadness is essentially viewed as a normal reaction to the adversities of post-resettlement stress and migration, whereas PTSD is just simply viewed as fear, right? So it's PTSD is really unknown to a lot of people in Afghanistan. The term trauma is really unknown. Not to say that it's not culturally relevant or anything like that, but the term is not known, so they just kind of view it as being fearful. Right? So we conducted a study in Afghanistan that looked at help seeking as well, and I hope this provides some additional insight into the types of things that Afghans are doing to remediate their stress. And this study was conducted in Kabul with about 300 or so people. And mind you that most of these people in this sample were young, and you can see that the majority of our samples sought help from family and friends, but first it was prayer and reciting Quran. And then, seeking help from a herbalist or tabib is the Dari word for it. Only 15% of our sample, but then mental health professionals and primary care physicians, they're on the lower end, as you can see there. So you have to understand, though, the concept of seeking help outside of the family for the Afghan people is very new. So between 1994 and 2001, believe it or not, there was one psychiatrist in the country that actually served the Taliban for their needs. And there's a BBC article about that. So there's one psychiatrist in the country, and just until recently, fairly recently, after 9/11, you had this integration of mental health services into the primary care sector to make mental health or the treatment seeking less stigmatizing and more accessible to people. But the concept in general of seeking help outside the family for personal problems or psychosocial challenges is a very new thing for Afghans. And that's something that I think as practitioners you ought to expect with these new evacuees that are resettling. So furthermore, this I hope contributes to your knowledge of the way in which they view treatments for depression and distress. So we asked a number of refugees down in San Diego how they conceptualize, depression, right? So we asked them about their views on the causes, symptoms, and treatments of depression. So so they endorsed the fact that depression is treatable, it's curable, that it won't go away on its own. And they endorsed both biomedical or antidepressants and seeing psychiatrists, and traditional systems of care as helpful in remediating depression. Right. So the only challenge here is that, of course, they endorse these views, but whether or not they would actually see a biomedical practitioner during an illness episode is questionable. We didn't go as far as asking those types of questions. But nonetheless, what you see from, the studies that have been, the limited number of studies on Afghan refugees and their help seeking that have been conducted, what you see is that, they seem to be open to help seeking. They're very open to help seeking outside of the family and from, help seeking from, professionals. So it's not just clergy that they would potentially be willing to see, for dealing with their challenges, but also psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists alike. So what does the research on help seeking say, though, about other Muslim and non-Muslim refugee groups? Well, a systematic review, consolidated about 60 studies or so, looking at perceptions of formal and informal help seeking. And, perceptions about pharmacological interventions seem to be pretty positive across the board, across many different studies, studies of Sudanese, of Somalis, of Syrians and Iraqis, and a couple of these studies were actually on Afghans as well. And then they viewed psychological interventions and traditional treatments. The views were pretty mixed, in that some were positive and some were negative. And perceptions of informal help seeking, views towards that was, pretty positive. And informal help seeking is really just seeking help from family members and clergy, whereas traditional treatments are maybe taking herbs and whatnot for reducing, mitigating distress. Right. So what explains their apprehension towards seeking psychological interventions? I think one of the things in talking with community members is that they don't really know, aside from psychiatrists, because there's a term in Dari for the psychiatrist, right? So psychiatrists and their and what they do is understood, is recognized in Afghan society and culture, right? But what do psychologists and therapists alike, what do they do? I'm not sure if Afghan refugees really understand their role and what they do for people. And, another issue that comes up is mistrust in these individuals and in mental health professionals, because some of those mental health professionals could very well be from their own communities, and the interpreters that are there helping them perhaps even know the refugees that are seeking help and know their families. So there's an issue of confidentiality and mistrust that can really serve as a barrier for seeking help. And then there's also practical and logistical barriers as well for, seeking mental health, professional mental health, and things like just being able to show up at a clinic because you don't, because of transportation challenges or logistical barriers such as that, essentially. And so it's really the lack of knowledge about mental health services, trust and confidentiality, and some would even say it's their lack of trust in authority figures, is rooted in their experiences through the migration process. Their lack of mistrust in authority figures is a reason for why they wouldn't seek help from a therapist. So I like to circle back to sources of strength and resilience, and faith plays such an important role in Afghan society. It's a term called Iman in Dari, and it plays such an important role in Afghan society. Family unity and harmony, as you can see here, morals, maintaining morals, perseverance and effort, working hard to overcome adversities, and maintaining one's honor. And all of these things together are what promote a very important concept in Afghan society called hope. So to maintain hope, Afghans will try to uphold these different cultural assets here. And I think as practitioners, we need to be aware of these different cultural assets. So I think the important takeaways from my part of the presentation are that Afghans are open to seeking help from professionals such as yourselves, right? But you have to ask, what exactly are they seeking help for? Is it really symptoms of depression or PTSD per se, which some whom really don't know, don't know really how to define these different disorders, right? Are they really disordered, or are they just distressed as a result of the psychosocial challenges that resonate from, cultural conflicts, intergenerational conflicts, and acculturation challenges, and socioeconomic problems? And I think another important thing to consider is ways in which we can destigmatize mental health help seeking, to make professional help more acceptable by destigmatizing strategies. Yeah. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have, and I thank you for your attention. I hope to take questions at the end from you guys, but I'll go ahead and pass it over to Dr. Miller, who will talk about post-resettlement stressors and the Afghan symptom checklist. And these are some of my references, and that right there says thank you in Dari, Tashakkur.
Thank you, Dr. Lemmy. So how do I share my screen? What's the secret to that?
I just gave you sharing privileges. You should now be able to go to share and drop down and select share screen.
Oh, that would make sense. Share my meeting window, I guess, right? So that's what I see.
Go to share content.
I'm in the upper left menu, right?
Yep, upper left, third one over says share.
Yeah, share
And the
content.
very first one should say
yes.
share content.
I got screen. Okay, I think I got it here.
It looks good.
Okay.
I'm seeing your web browser. And now I see, yep, you can shift to
Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we see your slide.
Okay, fantastic. And you can hear me okay?
Yes. And Sarah, can you confirm that the recording's going? Oh, I see it glowing. So that's all well. Back to you, Dr. Miller.
Hey, everyone. Thank you. This is amazing feat of technology. Dr. Lemmy, I know you're in Southern California. I'm in Amsterdam right now, and the rest of you are wherever you are. It is a pleasure to get to speak with you today, and to share some of the work that my team and I have done over the years, my various teams. I'll focus on two topics in the next 40 minutes or so. The first half, I'm going to talk about post-migration stressors and the way they impact refugees. And I'm going to speak about refugees somewhat generally. And then Dr. Lemmy and I'm going to invite him in towards the end to talk a little bit about Afghan refugees in particular. But in general, the factors that affect the well-being, the adjustment, the integration, the mental health of refugees tend to be common across different refugee groups. And then there are specific differences in the salience of different things within different communities. So we'll talk about that and the implications of that research for what we do to be helpful. And because if it doesn't have implications, it doesn't matter. It's just basic science. But I think we're all here because we want to figure out how can we be of greatest support to Afghans living in or coming into the country. So that'll be the first part. And then the second part, I'm going to talk about this screening tool that we developed in Afghanistan called the Afghan Symptom Checklist. And again, at one point, I'm going to ask Dr. Lemmy to jump in and join me there, because he's also used that in some of his research with Afghans in Southern California. So let me jump in here, talking about post-migration stressors in the mental health of refugees. And I want to start with a really simple question, and that is, what accounts for distress or suffering among refugees? And, up until about the year 2000 or so, the answer would have been seemingly obvious. And for a lot of folks, it still seems pretty obvious. Well, It's whatever they experienced here during whatever armed conflict forced them to become refugees. And that's commonly referred to as the war exposure model. And that really came into being in the late 70s and held sway for about 25 years. That was right around the time when you had a massive influx of refugees from Southeast Asia and from Latin America coming into the US, into Europe. And it was also around the time that PTSD was born as a diagnosis in 1980 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. So you had this trauma diagnosis appear just as there were these massive influxes of refugees, many of whom had histories of horrific violence and loss. So this very simple model, armed conflict gives rise to, hence the arrow, distress, is what guided research and practice with refugees. And so it led to lots and lots of interventions focused on healing what was assumed to be war trauma and war-related depression and anxiety. And yeah, so that's just restating what I just said. So then these are the kinds of images, right, that make the war exposure model so intuitively sensible. These images of violence and destruction, that's Syria. Here's a couple of kids being held by one of the most terrifying militaries in Latin American history, which was the El Salvador government in the 70s. Bosnia, this is Omarska, the most infamous of the concentration camps for Bosnian Muslims. Sri Lanka, this is shortly after a devastating bombing by the Tamil Tigers in downtown Colombo. And this is Kabul, a picture that I took when I was there in 2004. Devastation by one of the competing factions in the civil war. And the last one, Syria. This is probably the face that brought the horrors of the Syrian war around the world more than almost anything else. So these kinds of images, plus the reality of just the violence and destruction of war, make this war exposure model intuitively logical. People have been through hell. Of course, they have trauma, they have depression, they have anxiety. The only problem with the model is it's not quite wrong and it's not quite right. What it is fundamentally incomplete. And starting in the late 90s and then really moving through the present, we have been developing a more complex and I think much more useful and more accurate model. And in this model, one of the key additions is something that goes by different names, most commonly post-migration stressors or daily stressors or exile-related stressors. These are the stressors that people experience after they become displaced. And I'm going to talk about examples in a moment. Post-migration stressors have been studied a lot now. My research teams in different countries have looked at them, but dozens of folks have looked at them in the last 15 years. And what we have learned is that they have a profound effect on mental health, both of refugees and asylum seekers, and on people's capacity to integrate successfully. These represent what I would call the indirect effects of armed conflict. All right, so what am I talking about by post-migration stressors? These are just examples. This is not an exhaustive list. Social isolation and loneliness is one of the most powerful because people leave behind their social networks, their communities. Work restrictions and lack of relevant work skills lead to unemployment, lead to poverty, lead to poor housing, lead to shame. And this is just a wonderful reminder that the sources of psychological distress and disorder are often non-psychological in nature, right? In other words, we don't have to look at genetics or early childhood to understand how someone who's unable to provide for their children or their family and ends up living in abject poverty and in poor housing is going to be very anxious and depressed. And the solutions, as I'll get to in a couple moments, are also not always psychological, even though those solutions can dramatically improve mental health. Difficulties navigating the new environment. This sounds so simple, but people who come, for example, from a rural area and suddenly face an urban transportation system, urban healthcare system, the large bureaucracy of social services can just be utterly overwhelmed. And, you know, when I was a director of a clinic for Bosnians in Chicago, I remember we had clients who literally would not leave the home. They were so frightened of navigating the bus and the train. And that can lead to feelings of helplessness and vulnerability. Discrimination is one of the most powerful sources of depression and anxiety among refugees in the United States and elsewhere. And it is sadly, as you all know, dramatically on the rise these last several years. And then this is a very, very critical issue for me personally. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the most profound experiences I ever had as a clinician, when I was directing the clinic in Chicago for Bosnians, we had a woman who was severely traumatized, and the counselor who was meeting with her every week just was having no impact for 9 months of regular therapy. And the psychiatric meds weren't having any impact. Finally, when she got acutely suicidal and ended up in the hospital, we discovered that every day for the 2 years she'd been in Chicago, her husband had been sexually assaulting her in front of their little child. It is so easy to see symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, look at somebody's war history and draw the causal link. And what it can lead us to do, and I've seen this over and over and over again, is overlook current stressors that people are experiencing that may be highly traumatic. One of the things we know, for example, is harsh parenting increases in highly stressed refugee families. We also know that there's an increase in intimate partner violence. So when we see trauma, we see symptoms of acute anxiety, we always have to ask about the here and now of potentially traumatic stress and not just what came before. Additional stressors when we look at asylum seekers or refugees who have temporary status, the single biggest fear, of course, is fear of deportation, which can really, and this has been well studied actually, particularly in Australia, this has a big impact on mental health. And once people shift from temporary status to permanent status, you see a big improvement in mental health. Asylum seekers who are detained, very high rates of depression, suicidality. And then people who are undocumented, of course, can have a very hard time accessing social services. So these are what I talk about when I talk about post-migration stressors that affect well-being. So if we go back to that original war exposure model, now we're going to add in these post-migration stressors. And this is commonly referred to, this broader model, as an ecological model of distress among refugees. Now we see this direct pathway from armed conflict to distress, because of course war-related trauma, war-related prolonged grief are real things, but now we also have this other pathway. Now, a warning here, this next slide is the kind of slide that in PowerPoint trainings they teach you never to use. So I'm going to just expose this to you briefly, and then I promise to forward through it. This is just a detailed version of that ecological model, and it's not exhaustive in what's included, but let me just very quickly. So here, this top 2 rows here, right, from armed conflict exposes people to violence, to the loss of family members and friends, and that impacts mental health, individual, which in turn, of course, affects the well-being of families, and the well-being of families affects the individual mental health. But armed conflict also gives rise to displacement, to becoming refugees. And that leads to this host of post-migration stressors, which then impact mental health. That's really just meant as a more detailed graphic of what I'm talking about, but let's leave that behind now. So now this is where I like to pose the question, so what? I am passionate about research that matters and very impatient with research that doesn't, particularly when it concerns people whose lives are upended and in very challenging circumstances. It has to matter. And so the question is, why does this broader ecological model matter? Well, the reason I think it matters is that it has very important implications for intervention. The first thing it suggests is that there's a need for coordinated multi-service approaches to supporting refugees' mental health and integration. Sure, of course, we do need to address trauma and grief related to pre-migration experiences, right, of violence, of loss. But that was the entire model for 2 decades. That was what mental health folks thought refugees needed. And what I want to suggest, and what I think the ecological model suggests, is that that's one part of what's needed. And that the other parts, most fundamentally, are addressing ongoing or post-migration stressors in the here and now. And what I want to say about that is that the more we help refugees adapt successfully to the here and now, their current environment, the less we will need formal mental health services. Post-migration stressors actually account for more variance in distress than prior war exposure in lots of studies. In other words, if you want to ask what explains the stress among refugees, it turns out it's the stressors in the here and now that are even more pressing. Of course, we don't want to create that dichotomy of what's important, what came before or what's now. All of it matters, and it's different for every person. It's simply wanting our assessments to include both what came before and what's going on now. Examples of ways that we can address post-migration stressors, most of it's not rocket science, and a lot of folks in a lot of cities are doing these things, providing training in new work-related skills, create and link to settings that foster social support and new social networks. So this means that mental health clinics, social service clinics need to be partnering with community centers, helping support the development of community centers for a specific, whether it's Afghans or Bosnians or whoever you work with. Religious settings can be enormously important. Now, I don't want to oversimplify that. Religious settings are complex settings. They can be very supportive. They can be complicated. But in my experience working for 3 years in the Afghan community in California, what I found was that the mosques were an incredibly important source of social support, of community, of social services. And so the more mental health folks can partner with religious leaders and religious settings, I think also that's another great way for mental health folks to get destigmatized. When religious leaders can say to someone, you know what, I think it would be great for you to speak to someone at the, whatever mental health center, that has a very different sound to it when the imam is saying that than when a social worker who's non-Afghan is saying that. I think we need to be working with schools, and that is happening, to provide support for refugee kids to ensure their social inclusion. And I cannot tell you how important this is to their mental health. It turns out that discrimination is, I think, the strongest predictor of depression among refugee kids. And so we can work with schools to help them understand the mental health needs and vulnerabilities of refugee kids, train the school personnel in that, and help them develop programming to minimize discrimination and maximize integration. Simple stuff like strengthening refugees' capacity to navigate their new environment, transportation, language, access, and key systems. Not rocket science. You can actually train people from the community to be liaisons, cultural liaisons, and it's fabulous, and it's so empowering. And empowerment is the antidote to so much depression in refugee communities. This is a really important one. It's one I'm passionate about. For the last 5 years, I've been working with Syrian refugee parents in the north of Lebanon. Refugee parents do have higher rates of stress and distress than non-refugee parents. And that can lead to compromised parenting. Either they're less psychologically available, or they rely on harsh parenting practices more. Interestingly, the way that the mental health community has responded to that is by going in and teaching parenting skills. Well, imagine you're super stressed, you've lost your job, you've lost your home, and you snap at your partner. And a psychologist knocks on the door and goes, "Hi, I'd like to teach you some relationship communication skills. I saw that you snapped at your partner." You're like, "No, I don't need relationship communication skills. I need a job." What we need to be doing with refugee parents is supporting their own well-being, helping them manage their stress, helping them manage whatever distress and stress they're dealing with, even as we can all benefit from evidence-based parenting methods. And what we found in our intervention with Syrians is that when we addressed parental well-being and not just parenting, the impact was marked in the improvement in parenting. So this is real important. Be alert for and ready to address family violence. Again, not all PTSD symptoms reflect war exposure, even among refugees. And that's such an important point. Doesn't mean that your organization needs to know how to respond to intimate partner violence, but you should sure have a phone number ready where you can link people to protective services. And then again, just advocating and ensuring access to whatever legal services people may need. I want to invite Dr. Lamida to hop in. Kais, if you want to join me here. So I've been speaking generally about refugees. I spent 3 years working with Afghans in California, but I never did a rigorous study of the sort you did in Southern California with Afghans. So I wondered if you might want to share anything about the kinds of post-migration stressors that you found to be particularly salient in your work with Afghans in the US.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Dr. Miller. I'm just hoping you guys can hear me okay. I'll just go ahead and turn off my camera just in case. So some of the research that I did down in San Diego County was on refugees that recently resettled to the United States and those that have been here for decades. And what you generally find among Afghans down in San Diego, at least, is that, the experience of, post-migration stress, I suppose you could say it's highly gendered in that, men and women, perceive different stressors. But what they generally share is that, they both face or deal with intergenerational conflicts, with their kids. And also another important stressor for these individuals was family separation. It's a type of trauma, right? So family separation and concerns over family that are still stuck abroad somewhere was a big stressor for people, in addition to intergenerational conflicts. But, specifically among men, I found that, especially among the first generation, is that status loss was a really big issue. And, that came with, financial hardship. Also, status loss was a very big one. And, if you look at it, if you look at our research, Carl Stempel and I's research, using census data, it really speaks to this in a sense that we show that, in a large representative sample of Afghan refugees in the United States, that, Afghans haven't fared any better than other refugee groups in terms of their economic mobility or improving their economic status. And that's because of that status loss. There's really no programs available here in the United States that recognize, foreign degrees for people who are highly educated in Afghanistan. So they end up with menial jobs and whatnot. And that's a big stressor for a lot of people, a really big hit on the ego, but for men especially. And I think what I found among women was that loneliness and isolation, especially during the first years of resettlement, where women weren't able to speak English nor drive a vehicle, was another really big stressor. So yeah, again, highly gendered and, highly gendered post-migration experiences. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Kais. That's enormously helpful. And actually, it's so helpful. I don't really have that much to add because I think what you described is exactly what I saw in Northern California. And I think understanding the power of that loss of status and the important, and Afghanistan is a highly, in some ways, a higher honor and dignity and status are enormously important. And that's true, I think, in a lot of places. But the experience of becoming a refugee, there is dignity in any work, sure. And if you can get a job as a janitor, that's fine. But imagine you were a professor at Kabul University, or you were a doctor, whatever it might have been, and you are unable to work. And you end up working at something. And I've seen this a lot. And it becomes a source of shame. And you see this particularly among men. And then what you said about women, I've seen this so much, particularly among older women. who end up feeling enormously isolated and separated from the extended family that they had back in Afghanistan. And the answer to that, I think, is figuring out how to create settings that women can get to. And that can be as simple as creating transportation systems that are culturally acceptable and where women can come together. I think it is enormously important and enormously powerful. What I want to do, we'll have plenty of time for discussion. I'm sure you all have lots of different experiences, and I know Kais and I both welcome conversation and discussion. But I want to quickly jump to my other topic here. If I can figure out how to do that, let's see. Okay, I think what I need to do is, oh, here we go, let's see. I guess I need to stop sharing for a moment and then just switch presentations.
Yes, you're on the right path.
I'm on the right path here, okay. And here we go. So I'm gonna now go back to that from the start and then share my screen again, which I now know how to do. All right, now can you see that? It should say Afghan Symptom Checklist. Is that visible? Someone? Yes? Yes, good. Thank you, Kelsey.
Yes,
I still have not adjusted to the online world. Okay, so on the right, you just see that's the team extraordinary team that I just worked with, that I worked with in 2004 to 2006, developing the Afghan Symptom Checklist and using it in a series of studies. So, okay, so here we go. What is the ASCL, or the Afghan Symptom Checklist? All right, so it's a brief questionnaire, 23 items. How often in the last 2 weeks, or whatever time period you like, have you experienced each of these items? And you know, and the answers range from not at all to every day. So we'll get into it all in just a moment. Just a brief overview. We developed it and validated it in Afghanistan. It's been used now with Afghans in quite a few other countries, including the US. It includes, and this is what sets it apart, I think, from a lot of measures, both universal and culturally specific items. And it's why I think it's so useful with Afghans. So let me pose this question. Why create a culturally grounded questionnaire? And probably the most important reason is that Western psychiatric questionnaires don't include several items that are really important to Afghans. And here I have to say that I think Western psychiatry and clinical psychology, we've tripped ourselves up through a certain kind of, I guess I would call it arrogance, in lieu of a better term. We have assumed that the symptoms of distress that we've identified in our work in the US, in Europe, in Australia, are truth, that they are the universal way in which people express distress. And since we've already started with that assumption, our questionnaires ask about those things. The problem is if you go into a country like Afghanistan, you will find those things, but what you won't find are the things you don't ask about. And I wanted to start from a very different perspective. In fact, I was at a meeting in Minnesota back in 1999 where a group of us, anthropologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, we all wanted to take a different approach. We wanted to say, is there a way we can integrate qualitative and quantitative methods to create measures of well-being and distress that reflect how those things are experienced and expressed in different places, and to do it in a methodologically rigorous way. And that is how I ended up trying out this methodology that we collectively came up with. A culturally grounded measure should use items that make sense to the people who are filling out the measure. If it asks about things like Kais was saying earlier, right, the Afghans aren't really that familiar with the concept of PTSD. You can translate the items, and you can find Dari or Pashto or Nuristani words that correspond to them, but it doesn't mean they make a lot of sense to Afghans or that it's how they express traumatic stress. And so the idea of the culturally grounded measure is that you do something, you create something that actually is meaningful and makes sense to the folks who are completing it. And what that then does is it creates a shared vocabulary between service providers and the Afghan individuals or families who they're working with. If you can talk about jigarkhun or asabi or fishar, these terms that I'll come back to in a couple of moments, Afghans will know exactly what you mean. And the communication immediately takes off. If you talk about PTSD, you're going to spend a lot of time explaining what this thing is that we in the West are so familiar with, but much less so in Afghanistan. So we did this method that we used was the method that the Minnesota group and I came up with. It begins by identifying local symptoms or indicators of distress, in this case among Afghans, using these to create a questionnaire, pilot testing it with a small sample, adjusting it as needed, then testing your measure in a large sample. You examine its validity, its reliability, and if that all works out, then you put it out into the world, research, clinical practice, screening, needs assessment, blah, blah. And that's really what we did. So what I want to do is just quickly walk you through, because I think it was kind of cool. It was a really powerful experience. What we did is we had a remarkable team, 2 men and 2 women who are our surveyors. And they went out in the first phase, and they went out into 2 different communities, neighborhoods of Kabul, and they interviewed people. And they asked them to think of 2 people that they knew. Someone who had suffered during the war, which the war was just the entire last 25 years, and who was doing well now, and someone who suffered during the war and is continuing to suffer. Tell each person's story and then describe in detail, how did you know that they were suffering? What was it that let you know that? And we ended up with 40 stories, 20 women, half of whom were not doing well, half of whom had recovered, and the same for men. They went out into the communities, they came back with their handwritten notes. And I want to share one, forgive how crowded the slide is, but I want to share one story so you can see where these indicators of distress came from. So this story is from a woman, and she's talking about her mom. So the woman says, we were 4 sisters and 4 brothers. 2 of our sisters were older and the rest of our brothers and sisters were younger when our father died of natural causes. Our mother raised the children in poverty. During that time, the fighting was very bad. One of our brothers left home to go get groceries. He was only 21. The fighters asked him where he was from, and then they killed him. This affected our mother very much. 2 months later, our 18-year-old brother left to go get groceries, and a bomb hit that area, and he died. Our family was at home, but they brought the bodies to our mother. Our mother continued to live her life, but she's very weak. She works at a hospital. Her pay, which is about $36 a month, helps her live her life. And her 2 sons live with her. She always has a severe headache. Her fishar, and I'll describe what that is in a bit, is always high, and she has diabetes. She doesn't have much of an appetite. She often becomes jigarkhun, deeply dejected, heartbroken, and cries a lot and tries to stay away from people when she's at home. She tries to stay away from gatherings, and if she does go, she gets very impatient while she's there. Every time she thinks about one of her sons and how he was shot with holes in his body and how the other one was shattered into pieces because of the bomb, she becomes asabi, highly agitated, aggressive, angry. And if someone talks to her, she becomes angry and starts fighting. When she's at home, she puts a curse on the people who took her sons away from her. She prays, and she does not have a good relationship with her family. Well, if you look at this narrative is filled with both what we might call universal and culturally specific indicators of distress. And what we did is this is just sort of examples of both of those. So you see things like crying, nightmares, insomnia. This one doesn't mention thinking too much, but when we looked at all the 40 narratives, thinking too much turned out to be the most common symptom of distress among Afghans. I don't call it culturally specific, even though it's the most common indicator of distress among Afghans, at least in the 2 studies that my team did. But we find this, it's like rumination. We find it globally. You find it in almost every culture. Culturally specific things, Jigar Hun, closest translation would probably be heartbreak. But there's no symptom on an American questionnaire that quite corresponds to Jigar Hun. Asabi is sort of stress-induced reactivity, or highly asabi, which can be rage. It can be when people are really traumatized and then they react, they lash out. Fishar Ebala. So the two fishars, one, these are tricky items because Afghans use them to refer to having high blood pressure and low blood pressure, fishar payin, but also to psychological states, feeling really agitated and emotionally pressured inside, or super lethargic, low energy. And it can be a little tricky to know if this is a blood pressure experience or just a psychological experience. And then one symptom that we found a lot, but we only found it among women, talk about gendered distress, and that's hitting oneself or beating oneself. And that is not uncommon among Afghan women when they're very distressed. Interestingly, Afghan men do not hit themselves. Afghan women are more likely to do so. If you want to view these symptoms in a different format, this is sort of useful culturally. You can think of some of them as falling at the individual level, some at the family level, quarreling with the family, violence against family members, social withdrawal, difficulty meeting one's responsibilities, and then at the community level, quarreling with neighbors, again, social withdrawal. Just a different way of looking at these symptoms. So what did we do? We then took the 23 most commonly mentioned items. We started with 25, but we dropped 2. They were redundant. We created an answer choice ranging from 1 to 5, never to every day. And the math on that is really simple. If a 1 means you never had any you didn't experience any symptom, any of these in the last 2 weeks, you end up with a score of 23. We could have done the 0 to 4. It might have been intuitively clearer. But in any case, the range goes from 23 to 115. 115 would mean you experience everything every day. And because literacy rates are quite low in Afghanistan, particularly among women, we created a visual graphic, which I find is enormously useful. And I've used some version of this in a lot of the research that I've done. We then did a pilot study with 30 women and 30 men in 2 neighborhoods of Kabul. All the items were understood very, very easily. The answer graphic was very clear. And I don't know how many of you folks are researchers or familiar with research metrics. The internal consistency of the scale was very high. What that simply means is all the items were measuring some underlying construct. And I know, Kais, that was a gross simplification. And as a stats professor, you can scold me later. But basically what this means is all the items got at the same kind of underlying construct, which is this distress or suffering, as we're calling it. We then used the measure in 2 large studies, each with 320 adults in half of the neighborhoods in Kabul, evenly split between women and men. We looked at the validity of the scale by seeing how well it correlated with Western measures of distress. And you should find a reasonably strong correlation. They run from 0 all the way up to 1. 0 would mean the measures have no relationship to each other. 1 means they're exactly the same questionnaire, asking the same questions. The 0.6 to 0.7, what that tells us is that our Afghan symptom checklist was measuring distress, that it related reasonably strongly to other measures of distress, but it's a low enough correlation that it means that the ASCL was measuring quite a bit of stuff of distress that the other measures were not. So it was capturing things that other measures were not capturing. The most frequently experienced symptom, thinking too much, as I mentioned, also headaches, insomnia, poor appetite, impaired functioning. This is all familiar to us in the West, but there are also a number of culturally specific items. Most frequently, jigar khun, this experience of heartbreak. You know, I saw Western researchers come into Afghanistan a lot, really focused on measuring trauma and symptoms of PTSD. In my experience, what Afghans experience far more than PTSD is heartbreak. People have lost everything. They have lost their homes, their loved ones, their hope for the future. And Dr. Lemmy talked about hope. You know, when I talk to Afghans about what allowed people to heal and recover from the most horrific events, the single most common word that I heard was hope and something called sabr. And sabr is a kind of a combination of patience and faith that allows you to hold on to hope. And in some ways, it's not that I think we're asking about the wrong things when we ask about PTSD, but we're not asking about some of the right things. As I mentioned, hurting oneself, common among women, non-existent among men. And in those studies, we identified particularly vulnerable groups. It won't surprise you that women were considerably more distressed than men, or at least they acknowledged it more than men. And widows were markedly more distressed than married women. Well, the Afghan Symptom Checklist took on a bit of a life of its own after we developed it. It was certainly being used by local organizations in Afghanistan as a screening tool, an evaluation tool. We used it in a study where we were able to document that daily stressors actually in Afghanistan were impacting mental health at least as powerfully as whatever people had experienced, you know, in terms of war-related violence and loss. And often the daily stressors were more powerful. And I'm talking about things like poverty, community violence, family violence, illiteracy, lack of access to healthcare. These were having an enormous impact on mental health. And then in a second study, we were able to show that traumatic war events actually were better captured. The effects of them were better captured by the Afghan.
Want me to leave the door open, or you be able to unlock?
Maybe someone can mute that.
Wait, no, if you go outside, you got to lock the front door.
All right. Anyway, that if you wanted to look at the impact of traumatic events in Afghanistan, the ASCL actually did a better job of capturing the effects than a widely used measure of PTSD. My friend and colleague Andy Rasmussen compared the ASCL with something called the self-reporting questionnaire, a very widely used Western measure with Afghans in Afghanistan, and found that the ASCL again performed very well, and particularly for women, did a better job at measuring their distress, and in particular because of the culturally specific items that it included that the SRQ does not. Then finally, Dr. Lemons used a study in several different studies, Afghans in Kabul, Afghans in Istanbul, Turkey, and in San Diego. And I want to invite you, Dr. Lemmy, if you would, to just jump in, and if you wouldn't mind sharing just a couple of key findings from your study using the Afghan Symptom Checklist in Southern California.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Miller. So, you know, my group and I were the first to use the ASCL outside of Afghanistan. So I'm pretty proud of that. And we found that the ASCL actually performed very well with refugees in San Diego County. And generally what we found is that the three most highly endorsed items from the scale were thinking too much, that came up the most, and then becoming jigarkhun, right? And also trouble remembering things. And there were some other items that closely followed, but these were the three main items that were endorsed by men and women. But then again, you found differences in the the severity of distress between men and women across 10 of those different items, I believe it was. And the other thing is we found that the ASCL actually converged, or was highly correlated with a Western measure of perceived stress called the perceived stress scale. In our regression models, right? And I know there's most of you probably aren't researchers here, so I won't bore you so much with the statistical details here, but we did a regression analysis to find different predictors of distress, and we found that those individuals who found their lives to be somewhat uncontrollable, the different aspects of their lives to be uncontrollable, actually reported higher levels of distress. We also found higher levels of distress among widows, women as well in general, and also those individuals who reported unstable income. Yeah, so again, the ASCL, I think it's a great tool, and it worked very well for me in San Diego. And so in a non-Afghanistan context, I think it's the tool you want to use to, capture baseline levels of distress and the new evacuees that are resettling. So I think it's very useful.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted that you're here to share that. What I want to do is I'm going to finish here because I'm mindful of time. I want to just say about 30 seconds of very quick things about the ASCL, what it is and what it's not. It is not a diagnostic tool. It cannot be used to diagnose any clinical disorder. To be clear, it is a screening tool. It is great at identifying individuals experiencing high or elevated distress. And you can do this in a variety of ways. There's no empirically established clinical cutoff, score above which someone definitely should get clinical care. And what I'm showing you now is a correction from the slides I sent out earlier in the week. The general rule of thumb I find with clinical assessment tools is scores above the first quartile, above the 25th percentile, are at least cause for looking at whether somebody has a clinical level of distress where some sort of clinical intervention might be helpful. By no means a hard and fast rule. That would be a score of 46. But by way of contextualizing that, in our research in Afghanistan, the mean scores were 68 and 63 for women. This is in two different studies, 50 and 52 for men. In Dr. Alemi's study in Istanbul, comparable scores. And then in San Diego, the combined scores were lower, but I would assume that there was a gender split in that study as well. But I think more than worrying about sort of what the exact point is at which we should have clinical concern, we can also look at specific items to look at where people are reporting high levels of distress. If people are reporting, so for example, I know, Dr. Shannon, you shared a 3-item screener that you're using that has 3 key items: thinking too much, becoming jigarkhun, and psychosocial functioning. If people are reporting that they are ruminating a lot, that they are becoming really jigarkhun, really down a lot of the time, and they're having trouble functioning, right? We don't need a lot more information than that to say this is of clinical concern. So it's possible to look at specific items, as you have with the 3-item screener there, and let that be a red flag or a yellow flag. And I'm going to close here so we have some time for discussion. I want to just, a note about language, yeah. So the measures available currently in Dari, which is probably the most widely spoken language in Afghanistan, Pashto, and Pashtuns are probably the largest minority group. They are the largest of the different ethnic groups within Afghanistan, but many Pashtuns also speak Dari. So you can usually get away with using the Dari language questionnaire, and that's the one that most of the research has been done on. But there is a Pashto version available, and then of course English, so you can understand all the items. Let's see what else. Just to mention, if you're interested in a deeper journey, and this is a bit of self-promotion, forgive that, but if you want to, if the story of the development of the measure and kind of the backstory to that experience in Afghanistan is of interest, there's a chapter on Afghanistan in my book War Torn, and part of what I do is take you inside the experience of these stories and developing the measure and what that was like. So anyway, I want to stop there, allow some time for discussion, and Patty, are you going to moderate that?
Yeah, why don't I just jump in here? Thank you so much for your excellent presentations. And I'm going to combine a few of the chat questions. But before I do, I think we need to get just a very nitpicky linguistic clarification question about the Afghan symptom checklist. Most of course, we are receiving Dari and Pashto evacuees. However, I have been told by most who are coming to Minnesota are Pashto speakers, and I've been told that the concepts in the Afghan symptom checklist, like jigar kun, these words do not translate the same way between Dari and Pashto. And I wondered if you could say something about that, because we have translated our screener into both items, and then we use the Afghan symptom checklist when needed, for deeper interviewing. But could you say something about the linguistic translation between those two populations and more?
If I could,
coming.
well, if I can give a quick answer. So my colleague Catherine Panner Brick and her team created the Pashto version of it, and I wasn't involved in that process. So I don't, I don't recall Catherine commenting that there were any problems with that. So this is really interesting. But what I would say, that I think, and Kais, I'm please jump in as well. I think that what I would do if there are concerns about that is I would get a couple of people who are fluent in Pashto and English. And there are lots of folks like that. So California has lots of Pashto speakers. And we simply need to do a rigorous translation of the measure from English. First off, we need to find out how Pashtun speakers talk about these local idioms if the terms don't translate. And you can either start with the Pashto version that I think I shared with you, Patty, that Catherine Panner Brick developed, or you can simply find out how people describe these same phenomena. You can also try just having one person translate the measure into Pashto, having a Pashto speaker, a second person, translate it back to English, and that back translation process, and then do just a kind of a group, we call it cognitive interviewing, where you have a group of folks go through every item and hammer out the exact wording that makes sense within Pashtun community, within Pashto. That involves a set of steps that's how we created the Dari version. I assume that's how the Pashto version was created, but I can't speak to that.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify that the terms are going to be a little bit different. So I want to just combine a couple of questions in the chat to ask sort of a big question. People want to know, are there any specific character traits that Afghan refugees look for when seeking professional help? And related to that, approaches that might be useful, like CBT versus client-centered versus mind-body types approaches, and related to that, what is the best approach for engaging men, women, and certainly in Minnesota, we've tried certain strategies for addressing the gender-based issues and helping women access care. But it's a general question about professional approaches for helping the diversity of Afghans access care and what might be helpful. I don't know if that's too broad.
Yeah,
Dr. Levin,
if I can provide my insight here. Yeah, sure, thank you. I would say that I wouldn't be surprised if many of the new refugees sought help from their general practitioners or primary care physicians. I'm not saying that's something that would be effective because I don't know how much primary care physicians are equipped or trained to, help mitigate their stress, other than, prescribing antidepressants or whatnot. And the thing is, Afghans would probably, seek help from a professional who's willing to listen to their stories, stories of, life in Afghanistan, the transit that they, endured, and also, life in exile, right? So they need people to really hear their stories, right? To really understand distress. I hope that answers the question. I know there was other parts to that question.
Any particular research on approaches that have worked or anything like that you want to share?
Well, there's some promise. An author Canadian, if I'm pronouncing that right, but they actually test. Oh, okay. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video here so it's not as choppy, but there's some promising research out of Germany by an author named Kananian who tests culturally adapted CBT with Afghan refugees, and it seems pretty efficacious. So it's research that's been recently published with refugees. So yes, I think Afghans would be open to those types of interventions so long as they're culturally adapted, and they seem to work according to the evidence from the recent study that I read. I
Can we?
also want to say that oh, I'm sorry, if you want to go on to the next question here.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think they would have a higher propensity of seeking help from clergy as well. But I've just been sort of reading in the chat here that yeah, clergy is an important resource for people, imams specifically. But I think these individuals, some of them probably need training in addressing the needs of these of refugees because what I've heard, and I talk to other researchers, and they tell me that they're you have to be cautious about sending or promoting the clergy because the thing is, clergy may very well emphasize culturally correct behavior in situations where parents present stressors that are associated with intergenerational conflicts, which end up further stigmatizing people. So clergy is an important resource, but they need to be equipped with knowing how to handle people's challenges. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions also about gender-based issues and strategies, especially since you were mentioning widespread intimate partner violence, and some recent 2021 national surveys reported high levels of intimate partner violence in Afghanistan. What strategies do you know of that might be useful in helping to address this larger family issue context? I think I can share what we're doing in Minnesota, but I'll throw the question to you.
Actually, Patty, I'd love it if you'd share what you're doing. I think that's a great starting point.
Well, I mean, because we're getting rapid influxes of families and they come as families, what we have, our intake starts with within the first 24 hours of medical intake, just to ensure medical safety. And as part of the medical intake, they do that short mental health screen you were referencing. But the general perception is that women will not talk in that family context with largely male interpreters. So we've started a process of telling all the women that we routinely refer all women to our women's clinic, which follows the medical intake, so that they can talk about female issues. The men tend to uniformly accept that. At the women's clinic, they address their strong interest in contraception, and they meet only with female providers and female interpreters. And it's there we have tried to do a little bit of education about U.S. law, domestic violence laws, etc. Women have felt that is too scary and intimidating one-on-one. So we are now kind of transitioning to more of a group family education model with gender-specific groups, men and women, addressing both health, accessing the healthcare system type health education, and then mental health education, which will cover healthy family functioning. And they have to come. They're in a congregate living setting, so we can just hold it at the hotel or remotely, given Omicron. And so it's been staged, trying in a destigmatized way to access and provide education. I don't know if there are other ideas.
I think that's wonderful. I wish we had a lot more time to focus just on this issue. In my experience working on gender-based violence, and particularly intimate partner violence in refugee communities in the US, it is an exceedingly delicate and challenging issue. I think the way you're coming at it is exactly what I would advocate, which is to say, women are going to be very reluctant to share this, but training physicians, primary care doctors, to be hyper attuned to indications of this and to be able to raise this is important. What I found in our work with Bosnian women was where we created a safe space. We created needlework groups because Bosnian women love to do needlework, and there was a mental health person or a social worker or a psychologist in the group, a woman, joining them, gently guiding the discussion to create a space in which people could talk about these things. But even once you establish that someone is experiencing intimate partner violence, you then have an enormously complicated next challenge, which is what do you do about it? It is in a refugee community, getting a woman and her children, for example, into a shelter is a very complicated thing. You may find a shelter that takes someone, but that's not a long-term solution. And the risk of much higher violence upon their release is a very real threat that one has to be concerned about. I think this is a topic that needs a lot more discussion, is how do we create long-term solutions around intimate partner violence? And are there ways of distinguishing between sort of really horrific long-term chronic abuse and shorter instances where I've seen where a man becomes highly stressed and has a one-time experience of becoming violent, and there isn't a need for a safe shelter, but for greater family support. So I wish I had something more definitive to offer, but I think this is just it's a topic we're just diving into as a set of related disciplines.
Okay, thank you. You know, we're right. I'm noticing, Ellen, close to 1:30 here Central Time, and there's a couple unanswered questions. I don't know if both of you have emails on your slides or how you want to handle that. And Ellen, there's been so many questions about how do people access the slides. I assume they'll be hosted on your website.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shannon. So to those points, I would say that we will be posting the slides on the website. Expect a wait of likely around 3 weeks. We are behind COVID with our communications partners, and they do need to be edited for accessibility. And both presenters will share the slides that they're comfortable with, the full deck, or if there are some that they choose to omit, they'll be posted as a PDF. If the presenters are comfortable sharing their contact information with the group, we can include those emails in the email that we'll send out to all attendees. That will include the link for the evaluation. Reminder, you need to fill out that evaluation to access your continuing education credits. So those points would help anybody who's looking for one-on-one follow-up. I would say that at this point, given the level of interest, if the speakers have any flexibility to stay on, and if that's the will of the group, that would be fine. But I do want to note that we are out of time in terms of the official schedule of the webinar at this point.
Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Shannon, Millen, Lainey, would you like to stay on for another minute or two to address some of these issues, or do you have other schedule commitments at this time?
I can hang out for a few more minutes. I'm happy to.
Okay. Back to you, Patty, then to pick one or two other questions. And for those of you who joined us and need to hang up, thank you very much. We'll just go for about 5 more minutes.
Okay, there was a question specific to sleep difficulties with newcomers from a neurologist online. I don't know if he's still here. And anticipated sleep difficulties. And there was a question about
I see Dr. Wolf raising his hand there. Yes.
Okay.
You may speak, Dr. Wolf.
Oh, thank you. So thank you for putting me on. I'm a retired neurologist. I am seeing uninsured patients at 2 different clinics, one of which sees people from other countries, Esperanza Center. I made a comment that with sleep difficulties can lead to overlap with medical illnesses. I know mostly about my own field, headaches, likelihood of seizures, cognitive difficulties, fall risks with less sleep. Could anybody or anyone comment, what should we expect medically and neurologically in the people that we are seeing. My wife and I are part of a core group that are helping a family of 3, with one of the wife being due to deliver in June, or their second child, in Baltimore this coming week. So thank you for taking my questions.
I mean, I can tell you what we're seeing in Minnesota, but do you other two want to respond, or? Okay. People obviously come in. We have about 25% rate of referral for issues related to sadness, worries, and sleep. And our medical intake team, refers to us. We have psychiatrists that meet, and they are prescribing medication for sleep disorders. But we're also seeing a whole host of very serious psychiatric issues, from serious mental illness that we've referred to, like first episode psychosis programs, to very specific traumatic brain injuries that are coming straight to TBI programs. I have a call in about 15 minutes with Walter Reed Hospital, someone who is coming here to Minnesota who was impacted by the suicide bomb at the Kabul airport. It's highly specialized damage, and very case specific. And here's where having sort of a multidisciplinary model to support and an ecological way of thinking about it, as Dr. Miller said, can really help, because having serious issues like that, it also impacts overall adjustment and adds stressors to all the issues that he was outlining. We also recommend, and there are online, like UCLA has a bunch of meditation and sleep meditations and recordings in the Dari language that I've vetted with our Dari interpreters, as you can find these things to help with sleep just by Googling them. There's also a few in Pashto, but not as many. So that would be helpful for people to share in terms of just basic breathing relaxation to improve sleep and providing that basic psychoeducation. Anything else? Anyone else wants to say?
Patty, can I jump in with two
Yeah.
follow-up thoughts on that? That was really helpful. One is, I think mindfulness, in my experience, so the intervention that I just finished evaluating with Syrian refugee parents, very traditional Islamic families, all of my colleagues there and in Palestine said, they're going to hate the mindfulness stuff. They're going to hate they don't like that breath stuff. Well, we took out the word mindfulness because it has, connotations of Buddhism, Hinduism. Boy, did people love it. And boy, did they point to it as some of the most helpful stress management techniques that they'd had. We adapted things, and I'm happy to share some of that with people. It was helpful in Gaza, where we tested it with Palestinians and with, but I think framing these things without any reference to mindfulness is enormously helpful. The other thing that's helpful to know, that in the Afghan cosmology around mental health, so there are, in my experience, and again, I think Kais, you may expand on this, but we found 3 categories of explanation. We found that there were the kind of biological explanations, which, what we would call craziness or psychosis. The Afghans understand that things can just go wrong biologically and lead to really psychotic kinds of behavior. There is life stress. And this is, and Afghans are pretty good at distinguishing the kinds of distress that you see in response to, all the things we've talked about today, the bombings, the poverty, the explosion. And then there's another category that is enormously important to know about with Afghans, particularly about university education. Oh, I got muted. And that is something called jinn possession. Jinns are mischievous spirits, and they are enormously real to a lot of Afghans. And jinn possession is a real syndrome. I don't mean to say that, I'm not taking a position on whether jinns are real or not. I'm simply saying that it's a real syndrome among Afghans. And they will sometimes explain really acute levels of both physical and psychological distress in terms of having been possessed by a jinn. Now, they're not going to volunteer that. And it's not so much that I'm suggesting a course of action, but it's really helpful to understand that their cosmology is very different. And the less kind of university educated they are, where they're exposed to all kinds of Western ideas, the more prevalent you're going to find ideas like jinn possession. And the solution to jinn possession that Afghans will point to is a religious leader, an imam, who's the only person who can get the jinn out. It's simply helpful to, it's not a cute, exotic thing. It is a very real lived experience. And several of my colleagues in Afghanistan swear that they either have experienced that themselves or they have worked with people who have experienced that. And it's spelled 100 different ways, JinnDgin, Jin. But it's a powerful thing. Not unique to Afghanistan, but very salient there.
Anything from Dr. Lemmy?
I think Dr. Miller pretty much covered it well, but yeah, I've heard a lot about jinn possession or jinn being evil spirit and whatnot, but it's not limited to Afghan culture. You find, jinn possession or this idea of jinn being existent in different Muslim or in different nationalities as well, that defined as Muslim basically. So yeah, you hear about it a lot. And in San Diego, of course, I haven't come across anyone who reported any of that type of stuff in our qualitative work. Adversities. I think Dr. Miller talked about adversities being a cause of distress, and there's things like jinn possession too, of course, but it's in a refugee, I think that's what you're going to get a lot of, is that adversities are the driver of the distress that people are facing. Yeah.
We had one final question. I don't know if we still have time about pregnant women, postpartum care, postpartum depression. And I just wanted to comment that many Afghan women are coming pregnant, or, they're delivering as soon as they get off the plane. And we've had a serious issue with the needs of pregnant women, the isolation and increased depression and exhaustion. What we're doing in Minnesota is we have an OB meet them at medical intake or pretty quick after medical intake and take them right into care. If they have a brand new infant, they definitely get seen right away. We are fortunate to have a psychiatrist who's volunteering with us, who runs the Mother Baby Postpartum Depression program in downtown Minneapolis. And so we have, sort of urgently gotten women to her, and she has safely started a few on Zoloft who have wanted it, even though they are nursing, and seems to be safe to do so. So I would say this is another high-risk group. I don't know who asked that question, if they're still on and want to ask something more specific.
I would tag in here and say that the next webinar in this series will be specific to Afghan arrivals who are pregnant or have recently given birth. And so we will be exploring this topic more thoroughly at that point. We hope that will be in March, and we will be sending that registration information out to all attendees here. So in the interest of time, maybe just if either of our speakers wanted to follow up on what Dr. Shannon just said.
I don't have more. Kais?
No, I have nothing to add. No, thank you.
I will now be the very least popular person by calling this webinar to an end. I think many of us share the feeling I am feeling, which is really wanting to continue this conversation. Not only is there a lot of wisdom to be gained here, but I would say on a personal and emotional level, it's been very uplifting to me to hear the voices of so many others doing this work and that sense of community as we do this very human work is a really important part of the day for me. So thank you humbly for sharing your wisdom, all three of you, and also for sharing your presence to everybody who is here today. Please look in your email for the evaluation link. Please fill it out. Be very, very honest, even though I'm in Minnesota. Please be frank. We use that very carefully because we want to craft webinars that are meaningful to the work that everyone is doing. So please especially look at the suggestions for future endeavors as well. And I know that many of you will be delighted to see the contact information of our honored guests on that email also. Thank you all so much for sharing your day with us. Doctors, thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom. And actually, I am fixing to pick up a copy of your book, Jen.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. My pleasure. Take care.